I think this is a common adage when you look at a league right before an expansion year like the WNBA is in, which is that it kind of gets harder to be bad. The bad teams keep getting better. You're seeing exciting teams who are playing coherent basketball, and they might still not make it above the playoff line because every team is improving. We're seeing more talent come into the league every year, and it doesn't have anywhere necessarily to go to expand. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Late Sub. It is Wednesday, May 15th, and we have some big games to discuss. The WNBA is officially back with an opening night slate that saw some duds, some grand slams, some great games, and a few surprises. Excited to break it down, and then we're going to talk about where things are at with the NWSL, where we're seeing some separation at the top, some separation at the bottom, and some really interesting matchups in the middle as people vie for playoff position. All right, so we're going to start with some of the biggest news of the week, which is, of course, WNBA opening night tip off. It's been a flurry of activity starting at the beginning of this week. We got final cuts for rosters. Everyone's set their official 11 or 12 player opening day roster. And then we got right into games, and they did not mess around. We got to see Caitlin Clark in the dub for the first time. We got to see the two finalists last year, see what they look like at the beginning of 2024. We got to see some rebuilding teams. We got to see some teams that have gone really aggressive in free agency. It was a fantastic first night. So we are recording this on Wednesday morning, Wednesday, May 15th. So we're not going to be able to get a look at every single team, but we did get a look at 8 of the 12 WNBA teams on Tuesday night. It was a really lovely slate of basketball. Real quick, just to run down results, and then we'll get into a little bit more analysis. Caitlin Clark had kind of an up and down game, which we will get into in a second, but the Connecticut Sun firmly handled the Indiana Fever 92-71. New York came back to beat what I thought was a sneaky good Mystics teams 85-80. Las Vegas held off, again, kind of an impressive Phoenix, 89-80. And then Minnesota, maybe call it an upset, maybe call it early days, but they pretty definitively took down Seattle, 83-70. So a lot to dig into here. I had this caveat when we were talking about early NWSL, which is that I'm not sure that anything in the first couple of weeks is going to be defining for any of these teams. The season is long, but like I said about soccer, I like these early days because sometimes it is a little bit more obvious what is working and what's not before fatigue sets in, before the schedule sets in, before these teams start to gel. So I like this early analysis. I think it's really interesting and maybe a little bit more dynamic than some of the nuances that you see later in a season. But we got to see a lot of firsts. We got to see a lot of really interesting things. So let's break it down. I want to start, we'll start with, the big headline, Caitlin Clark's first official WNBA game in Connecticut. We know the hot takes will be flowing after this one. I had SportsCenter on at the end of the games last night, and they definitely talked about Caitlin Clark. They talked about her debut. They talked about that opening slate, which was nice. So she finishes the game with 20 points, which is pretty good. I mean, that is not a bad opening scoreline for a rookie in their first game. But she also commits 10 turnovers, which is the stat that I think you might have seen last night on social media or might have seen discussed on TV, was that 10 turnover mark, because that was a new WNBA record for a rookie in their league debut. So that was the most turnovers for a rookie in their league debut in league history. She also had 3 assists and 2 steals. For Clark, I do think it was a little bit of a game of two halves, real rookie moments in the first half. Connecticut came out looking very strong, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you could see her kind of play her way into it later in the game. At the beginning of the game, she was trying those same sort of separated three-pointers that she's known for. Get a little bit of separation behind the arc, shoot from the left. And those weren't really hitting. Those were not hitting. I think she started, I believe it was 0 for 5, 0 for 6. But she started to get into a little bit of a groove there as the game went on. And you could see the floor begin to open up for her, at least with her court vision after that first half. I mean, I think people who know my work, who have listened to the Late Sub for a little bit, know that I'm not the one for the biggest hot takes, and I'm going to stick with that. Everyone says, Claire, slam it. And I go, no, I'm taking the middle ground on the turnovers. Not great, obviously. It was very indicative of a young team that's not exactly on the same page yet. And also the fact that the Sun were basically playing at a faster tempo on defense. You saw players get their pockets picked quite a bit. You saw players get a little bit nervous, a little bit jumpy in the attack. And that allowed the Sun to generate a lot of turnovers. The turnovers were a team-wide issue, but obviously one for Clark. However, some of those turnovers were what you would call communication turnovers or trying things turnovers. Clark is trying stuff with this Indiana offense that could maybe pay dividends in the future, maybe sooner rather than later. But everyone does need to get on the same page. And then Clark also, I think, needs to get used to the pace of play on defense, because some of those lanes, especially inside, are simply going to close faster in the pro game than they do in college. So the fact that she was attempting some of these passes inside, attempting some of these sort of you drive to the basket and you kick it out and you hope that a teammate is paying attention, you do probably like that she's trying those things, and maybe you're willing to eat the turnovers in that first game. But that's something that they need to continue to improve on. So some of the turnovers, not great, not ready for pace of play. But some of them were the kind of bravery that you need for a team like Indiana that does need to improve significantly this year. So some of them I minded, some of them I didn't. But in reality, for Clark, that game against Connecticut kind of felt like an entire game of the first 15 minutes of that matchup between Iowa and LSU in this year's NCAA tournament. People might remember that Clark had a couple kind of bad turnovers at the beginning of that game. LSU was packing the paint, and then she found the separation outside. What we saw in this game was kind of all of that, but without the separation outside. Dejanay Carrington was Clark's primary defender. She did a really nice job defending her on the perimeter, and she just wasn't hitting those separation threes. And then Dejanay actually had to step out. Carrington had to step out due to cramps, and then they just took Alyssa Thomas and moved Alyssa Thomas over on Clark, which, as people know, at the very least is a height management issue. And Alyssa Thomas, I think, relished those defensive matchups as well. So while defensive 3 seconds does exist in the WNBA, and that means that teams cannot kind of sit in the paint the same way that college teams do, what a WNBA team can do on defense that maybe Clark wasn't seeing as much in college is they can do both. They can take away your lanes on the inside, and they can get in your face on the perimeter. And how do you as a player keep finding your teammates, keep working the ball in, hit those shots that they do give you in order to make separation and sort of grind a team down? Because I think some of the mentality, maybe sort of how overwhelming the moment was for a number of players for Indiana, didn't really take Connecticut out of their game at all. They didn't really force Connecticut to stretch that much, which I think is maybe the more comprehensive point of this from a team-to-team matchup, which is I was watching this game, and Connecticut is so good at drawing a team kind of into the way that they want to play. They're really good at playing the foul game. They know how to get whistles when they go to the rim. They know how to play physical defense that doesn't cross the line at the other end, which can be very taxing for other teams. They do have this length. They are a tall team, and they can still hit from outside. They have a lot of different weapons. I really liked what we saw from the Sun. So maybe you watch this game, and I even had this thought. I thought to myself, oh, well, this is a mismatch, right? Connecticut to Indiana, player for player, is a mismatch, which is kind of expected for a team that does as well as Connecticut does consistently, the roster that they have versus this sort of rebuilding roster for Indiana. But maybe when you think about what the Fever want to accomplish this year, how they want to improve, how do they want to go from missing the playoffs to making the playoffs, the issue that you don't want to fall into is every game you go, oh, well, this is a mismatch. Oh, well, this roster construction is set up well to counter what Indiana is able to do as a team. You can't fall into that game to game, because suddenly you're putting together a lot of excuses rather than results. And actually, I think we saw Indiana struggle with that last year. They played a lot of really close games that they struggled to win. And so you say, okay, promising. Okay, they're figuring things out. But how do you go for that young, promising team, or you go, oh, the mistakes are understandable. Like I said, oh, they're trying things. Oh, you're not expecting it to be as smooth yet, into a playoff caliber team that is able to execute despite physical mismatches, or even, again, put together a roster that can compete with a team like Connecticut or New York or Vegas. So you don't want to overestimate kind of what Indiana struggled with due to this matchup, but I do think that they have some film to look at, and they have, at least in terms of the defense and the way that they want to move the ball, obviously, kind of got to cut down on those turnovers. When they were able to find each other, it looked pretty good. So how do you make that happen more often rather than less? So I'm talking about Indiana a lot and talking about the things that they could do better, but I think you also just have to look at the Sun playing really, really well. They were fantastic. The Sun perhaps looked like the best team on the whole night in the terms of, again, getting the game in front of them that they wanted, executing both inside and outside, and just the confidence that you see from their veterans. Alyssa Thomas got her 12th overall career triple-double. That's including regular season and postseason. She is by far the triple-double leader in the WNBA history, and I think that's just going to continue. That gap is going to continue to widen going into this season. She was someone that I thought really had a real argument for MVP last year, and she did finish second. I think she's going to come back with that same energy in terms of what she's able to do all around to also facilitate for her teammates in addition to scoring. DeWanna Bonner rose to 5th all-time in career WNBA scoring last night. Another player that you underestimate. I mean, everyone talks about like the DeWanna Bonner, the long threes, the long shots, and just what that does mentally to a team when she's able to execute from behind the arc. And a player that tall, who is that good of a defender, who is able to get inside, every time she showcases that outside game, it's like, man, how do you even defend that? I think you also have to look at how excellent their guards were. Dejanay Carrington was very good. Ty Harris was also very good. I was interesting to see Harris, especially with Natisha Heidemann no longer on the team. I think that they've gotten their guard play exactly right, and they have a lot of different ways to beat you. So for a team as balanced as Connecticut, again, I think they just kind of showcased what imbalances Indiana are still working with. I think I've said multiple times on this podcast, and I think people have talked about how excited people are to see Clark and Aaliyah Boston play together. They're still not really finding Boston inside. She only took 6 shots in this whole game. She had a hell of an assignment off of Brianna Jones, another very, very good player. But Indiana doesn't want to get into a pattern of giving Boston difficult assignments inside, not really giving her help, not finding her. And so the best she can do is cancel out another team's very good post player. That's not the best use of Aaliyah Boston's talents. She's an incredible high efficiency scorer. They do have to get her the ball a little bit more. So overall outlook on the Sun feels good. They were as good as anybody last night. We talk a lot about the 2-horse race between New York and Las Vegas, but I think Connecticut looks just as good as ever, and they're going to have something to say by the end of this season. And the Fever need to figure out their niche. They're not really going to get any load off. They have to play New York and then Connecticut again. So kind of a gauntlet to start out the season, but there's going to be some growing pains. But I don't know. I think Indiana, like I said, they're going to be a very fun team to watch because they do some things really well, and they are obviously just so naturally talented. But they are young and sometimes don't execute as well as they need to be. So even if it's not always good, it's going to be very, very exciting. But speaking of players that looked ready for the season from day one, A'ja Wilson for the Las Vegas Aces. Just listen to this stat line. She had 30 points, 13 rebounds, 5 assists, and 3 blocks. I think the other thing that really stuck out to me in this game was the obvious leadership from Wilson. Vegas comes out of the starting blocks super hot. They get a double-digit lead in the first quarter, and then their shot selection starts to go, and they let Phoenix back into this game. It was Wilson who was giving, the fiery interview to TV, talking about how nothing is easy, about how the team has to be locked in. You can't just go in and rely on maybe fundamentals or how things were going in practice when you're playing a team as good as Phoenix is. I thought it was so obvious how she was galvanizing and keeping the team locked in, and I'm very excited to see more of that from Wilson this season. They're obviously missing a player like Chelsea Gray. They were maybe expecting to have Candace Parker available this season before her immediate retirement. So Wilson is stepping in and stepping up, and I think that she makes her teammates better, even when they're not always finding her, because I did think that Vegas's greatest enemy in this game was their own shot selection. They're missing Gray a lot when they're bringing the ball up the floor. They were settling for long threes, for transition opportunities that didn't need to necessarily not get set in the half court. They could have slowed down a little bit. They could have, again, found Wilson inside. They had a height advantage over Phoenix for a lot of the time that Wilson was on the floor, and with Megan Gustafson on the floor as well. So I think that they could have, it's funny to think of the reigning champions also needing to calm down a little bit in the opening game, but it was just some of that decision-making from the guards that I think let Phoenix back into it. But then it was the decision-making down the stretch that got Vegas this win. They were really good at getting contact, driving to the rim, and I think that was the big separator in the fourth quarter. So it was interesting to see Vegas almost moving too fast, the tempo almost too quick. They wanted to kind of shoot Phoenix out of the court or out of the gym. Couldn't quite get that done in the second and third quarters, but it was when they slowed down, when they started pushing for contact, when they started driving to the rim and making good decisions, that's when they were able to separate themselves. So I think Vegas has to feel good about actually the things they can probably improve on with Gray out. Because it is nice perhaps to say, oh, well, there's this obvious issue with bringing the ball up the court. And then they go, oh, well, we know how to fix that. We'll bring back in Chelsea Gray. So I always like to see, I think the more mercurial, pardon the pun, aspects of the Aces game is sort of how the guards are playing every night. And I think Jackie Young and Kelsey Plum had like their moments. They kind of had those moments where they moved the ball too quickly or tried an ill-advised shot. But they also worked through that. And I think the longer this core group works together, the better that will be. I also just really liked what Gustafsson brought. She's going to be their other big, they have a number of players they can work into that role, but I liked what she brought as a big, perhaps when Wilson needs to sit. So I liked that. Phoenix, though, I was kind of impressed despite the loss. They're playing very small ball right now. They don't have BG available because she is dealing with a toe fracture. So they have to just get used to a lot of guard play, small ball, move the ball quickly, hit from three. And hit from three they did. Diana Taurasi had a great game from behind the arc. She made 7 3-pointers. Clea Copper could be like the sneaky best pickup of the whole offseason, to be honest. She's such a versatile player. In each possession, she can fill different roles that people need, whether it is hitting from behind or driving to the rim. She's so fast, too. It's just when she gets rolling downhill, she's so hard to stop. They're not really set up to compete with teams inside, which is why it took Vegas kind of shooting those long threes to let them back in the game. But for what they have available to them, it seems really tight, it seems really organized, and they seem 100% bought in. So I'm excited to see what we see from Phoenix, because I think that if they were able to sort of work through that game against the Aces and keep it close and go on runs, I think they're going to be able to do that to a lot of other teams in the league. And then obviously once they get BG back, they get their length back inside, and their rebounding changes and their ability to impose play in the paint. I don't know. Phoenix looks pretty good. They're fascinating. They could be one of the big, at least record turnarounds. I was laughing because this happens a lot with the WNBA where they show last year's record on the scorebug for these early games. And I'm like, well, it's kind of hard it doesn't totally tell the whole picture if you're looking perhaps at Phoenix's record last year versus what they're trying to do this year. And that's how quickly things can change in the WNBA. And speaking of teams that impressed me in a loss, the Washington Mystics, they are fun. They did not get the win against New York, but I liked a lot what I saw from the Mystics. Shakira Austin looked fantastic. She's coming off of a hip injury that required surgery. It's kept her sidelined for a little bit. She, oh my gosh, again, hitting inside, hitting outside, being that versatile player that they need, and even just sort of an emotional center for the team. Really, really nice. You could tell how stoked she was to be back out there. Thought she played really well with Stephanie Dolson in her first game for the Mystics. Brittany Sykes, really good. Brittany Sykes is so good at turning defense into offense. Kind of like I said, similar to a player like Copper. Once she gets rolling downhill, she can get those transition buckets. When she gets into the paint before anybody else is set, she's going to win you those easy layups. It's really exciting. And I thought their defense was very good. Like I said, defense to offense was really impressive. I thought Aaliyah Edwards in her early minutes did a very nice job. I think the most exciting thing for her, I think they did a nice job. They only played her about 16 minutes. They didn't ask her to do too much, but she's already building that chemistry with her teammates. You could see it with Dolson. You could see it with Austin, with Sykes. So I think they are a very close-knit group already, which is difficult to do with how short preseason is. They don't necessarily have that kind of A1 floor general right now. It's kind of like I mentioned with Vegas, but Mystics don't even really have that player on their roster, which hurt them late. They were in a very, very close game with the Liberty at the end, and they just weren't able to kind of get that after timeout shot on kind of blown possessions late in the game. They had a number of opportunities to get final buckets, and they just couldn't make it happen. And I do think that just has to do with having someone who can handle the ball, who can divvy out assists, and who can bring an organized sense of chaos to what they're trying to do in the offense. So maybe that's a piece that they go out for. Maybe that's something that they say we're playing the long game, and maybe we don't win as many games this season as we would like to, but we're always going to play teams tough. I'm curious kind of how they handle the whole arc of this season. But yeah, I really liked what I saw from Washington. Again, I don't know if they're a playoff team, and again, hard to tell from one game, but they're going to, if they keep this group together and they keep playing the way that they did against New York, I think that's going to be a very exciting team to watch. Speaking of New York, kind of the opposite. They get the win. They come back to get the win. They were leading in this game, and then they give the lead up, and they let the Washington lead balloon. It was like 8 or 10 for Washington, and then they come back to win this. They finally kind of grind Washington down. Jonquel Jones had a very good game inside, just very imposing, big in the paint for them. I also thought Benasia Laney Hamilton was arguably their best player. She wasn't their highest scorer, but man, the player that she has turned into, and just being sort of that all-around guard for the team, I think that where New York goes is going to be where Laney Hamilton kind of guides them. But maybe that's the point. New York had sort of an interesting preseason. They get blown out by Chicago in their first preseason game. They come back, they beat Connecticut in their second preseason game. So very different looks at the beginning of the season. Their whole concept of the offseason was that they wanted to run back this sort of super team that they put together in 2023. The adage that you hear over and over again is that we have the mix right. We have the right mix of players. They just need more time together. These are longtime veterans who are getting used to the system, getting used to each other's tendencies. And the whole idea was that through kind of that consistency from last year to this year, they would be able to elevate further than what they were able to do last year, which in and of itself, very impressive. They finished second in the league and they go to the finals. But instead of New York kind of looking like a new, more honed, more tightly wound, in sync sort of a team, it was a little bit more of the same. You saw a little bit more individual ball. Washington, like I mentioned, their defense, they turned New York over a fair amount of times. You saw turnovers as an early issue for the Liberty. You saw Jonquel Jones play really well. You saw Brianna Stewart be less effective. There's always that lingering question of how do you get Jones and Stewart both hitting together consistently? How do you get the guards on the same page so that those turnovers instead become assists? They're so talented. And like I said, they won this game. They're such a talented team. Really, really nice. Again, roster construction of 5 to, all the way to 11 really talented players. But it's just not that step up immediately. And I think that's interesting after an off season of cohesion, like I said. And they talk a lot about how they know each other better now than they did at the same point last season. So just interested to see for New York. I do think they'll start to put it together, but I'm just always curious kind of with that. You can really make the right decision to run it back, and it also can bite you. So I'm very curious to see how that works for New York. And then finally, this was a game that I was double screaming last night, and this was the game that I did not have the audio on, so I wasn't able to follow this as much kind of in person, but I did kind of I did have it on, and I did take a look at the box scores and the stats. And Minnesota, they take down a new look Seattle. It was a close game through 3 quarters before the Lynx kind of pulled away in the 4th. Minnesota has really benefited from Chicago's rebuild, funny enough. They picked up Courtney Williams and Alana Smith, who were both free agents out of Chicago from last season. They put Williams at point, which is a position that she really honed with the Sky last year. That was her big season project, was becoming an effective point guard. Minnesota has benefited from that work. And then Smith still just looks like she was an MIP candidate last year. She had 22 points and she had, I think it was 4 blocks. Really nice work from her. So Minnesota was very strategic, I think, in the free agency market, and they saw the work that was being done by some of these players a little bit more off the radar, and it's already paying off for them. And then I think the center point, the sun that the Lynx orbit around is going to be Nafisa Collier this year. She could be a sleeper pick for putting together some MVP level numbers. But I'm just impressed. I mean, I like Cheryl Reeve. I like the way Cheryl Reeve constructs her teams. I think she has a very specific way that she would like them to play. And I think sometimes when they have trouble, it's because she doesn't have the right players for that style. But early dividends looking good for Minnesota. And I liked that. I think the WNBA is more fun when the Lynx are good. Seattle looks a little bit like they need more time to cook with some of their big offseason pickups of Nneka Ogwumike, Skylar Diggins-Smith. Again, you look at the stats, you look at the underlying box score, you have to dig in a little bit to kind of see what went wrong. Seattle had an advantage in points off of turnovers. They had advantages in points in the paint. They had fewer assists, which sometimes is an indicator that there was more individual point scoring going on than sort of connecting as a team, which again kind of points to this idea that they have this brand new starting 5. They need to work on finding each other a little bit more expected with the major changes that they made in the offseason. So I don't think that Seattle fans should be too worried about this particular performance, but I'm always curious about kind of who puts these things together a little more quickly. Like I said, the Mercury, maybe actually through the fact that they don't have BG, was able to really focus on a very particular style of play that they probably don't even want to handle for the entire season, but that made them look really tight against Vegas, whereas I think Seattle, it's a little bit of a longer game where they're trying to work some of these great individual players in and get them working as a team. So I think that, again, Seattle fans shouldn't be too worried. I think the underlying stats here don't point to much more than they really struggle behind the arc, and 3 is more than 2. So I think they will work their way into the season. I still think Seattle is a playoff caliber team. But maybe here's my final kicker, kind of thinking about the WNBA, the realization that I had last night, perhaps, especially watching Indiana or watching Washington. This was something that we saw in the NWSL pre-expansion a lot, specifically the year before an expansion year, which is what the WNBA is at right now. They're going to expand to 13 teams next year. It gets harder to be bad, if that makes sense. You keep putting new talent into the league. You keep seeing players develop and raise their game. And this was a strong rookie class. I mean, we're not going to go into cuts too much, but all of the first round picks that were already intended to be in market this season did make their teams. A couple of late round gems did make their teams. Kate Martin, I think everyone was really excited out of Iowa. She made Vegas. Aisha Fair, she made that Vegas team. These good players are coming out of college and the league is not expanding. And so more than ever, you have this competitive cauldron of a WNBA entire league where objectively decent teams are not going to make the playoffs. Teams that are exciting, that are young, that are putting it together and maybe have obvious strengths and obvious weaknesses, they might finish outside playoff contention. It just keeps getting harder and harder to finish last. You know, the team that finishes last keeps getting better. And I think that's actually something that people said about Indiana last year, right? But what happens if that's still true for Indiana? They get better, but so does everybody else. We're seeing a lot of coaching turnover. I thought a lot of promising dividends from some of the new coaches. I can't wait to see like what Chicago can do tonight with Teresa Weatherspoon in her first official game as head coach. We're seeing all levels raise, which is very exciting if you are just a fan of basketball and a fan of the league itself and you love to throw on a game and you know you're going to see something really good every night. But it's kind of brutal if you're a fan of one team. It's brutal if you're a fan of a front runner because they're going to have some losses from teams that are harder than expected. And it's brutal if you're a fan of a team that maybe has a lot of positives, but is still putting it all together. But I do believe that. I believe that strongly. I think that this could be one of the most competitive seasons in WNBA history because you're even looking at the teams that, quote unquote, have more issues and they're still playing coherent basketball most of the time, which I think is fantastic. And then the one other thought, this was a big off the court topic this week. I don't want to go too much into it because I just thought there was a lot of really interesting stuff happening actually in these games, but the idea of charters, and this is kind of tying into that idea of competition. I think play will improve. The WNBA announced last week that they are phasing in full-time charters for all teams, league funded. So they have found that they believe that there's going to be a perpetual income stream that is big enough to support league funded charters. We'll see if it stays like that forever. There were some hiccups in the rollout, you know, kind of normal WNBA stuff. Some teams got charters, some teams did not. I think there is the goal that all 12 will have the flights that they need going forward, but I don't think there's any guarantee of that. I think that's obviously just sort of a frustration. I understand why that's a frustration for players, coaches, and GMs and fans. But watching Diana Taurasi play as well as she did in this game against Las Vegas, I thought to myself, wow, you talk about a player who could maybe really benefit from professional grade travel accommodations for a full WNBA season. Any of these players, I think I maybe mentioned at the top, right? Like there's more, games are more dynamic when players are fresh, kind of like you see at the beginning of a season. And you can really whittle down that overall fatigue where it feels like maybe the games become more of a grind in the, you know, dead of summer when you are supporting them in being able to rest and recover when they travel. So when I say that I think this could be one of the most competitive seasons of all time, I don't want to act like this is only in the players' hands. I think the more the league does to raise the standards and make competition easier for these players, the better the games will be. So when we talk about charters, I very much care about the players' experience, and I think that we need to keep raising standards on their behalf. But I think that the WNBA should also want this for themselves because they want this to truly be the best basketball league in the entire world and constantly breaking boundaries for what you can see in professional women's basketball. So very hopeful to see, hopefully, full charters announced very, very soon. Moving on to soccer. NWSL did not slow down one bit. There were mid-season games this week. There was a full weekend slate. And let me tell you, the NWSL has been loving a trend this season. We're seeing streaks. We're seeing things kind of extended week after week. I talk about teams being kind of fully formed. We're hitting this point in the season where I think teams are truly becoming who they are. So yes, there are some variable teams. There are some teams you don't know if you're going to get a win or a loss, but we're seeing some sort of self-perpetuating performances already. And just to list what some of those are, you're going to hear some of the same names that I've been saying all season because these streaks are real. Orlando and Kansas City still neck and neck, tied on points and good vibes. Really impressive by both of them. They are both undefeated. They are both sitting at the top of the table, tied on points. Kansas City currently has a slight advantage in goal differential. I'm taking a look at the schedule right now. They do not actually play each other until the beginning of July. So this could be going for some time. Very impressed by Orlando and Kansas City. Portland's resurgence is the real deal. They have now won 5 games in a row, which is a team record. So they kind of start with record lows at the beginning of the year. They move on to record highs. Hard to see Portland losing. They've looked really, really impressive. They're tightening up on defense, and they're finding ways to score. The struggles for the expansion teams continue. Man, this has been sort of interesting. I felt pretty good about both of these teams, I think, going into this year, but Utah hasn't won in 7 games, and BFC has lost 5 in a row. They're having a lot of trouble. I think when you maybe have some infrastructural issues with a roster that pop up early in a season, and then you do kind of again get into the grind. You can see mid-season games get put into the mix. You have to rotate. You have to travel. That can exacerbate issues for these expansion sides, and they're really having trouble, which is just kind of interesting. I think perhaps the California teams set very high expectations for what expansion. I say the SoCal teams because obviously Bay is a California team, but they set high expectations for what can be achieved in the first couple years of an expansion season. And I think maybe we're seeing a little bit closer to the mean when it comes to what we're seeing from Utah and the Bay. And then I also just think it's interesting that North Carolina has now lost 3 in a row. Some of the things that maybe you look at the losses and you say underlying stats look good, don't worry about it. Once you've lost 3 in a row, then you say, oh, maybe we need to start worrying about the final piece, which is the finishing, which is goals in the back of the net. We're seeing very clear separation at this point between the top and the bottom of the table. There's still a real tight mix in the playoff positions, but impressed by Kansas City and Orlando's ability to win close games. I actually happened to be in Kansas City for their weekend matchup against North Carolina this weekend. I went as a fan. I just went in the stands, wanted to get a full picture of what the fan experience is in Kansas City, and the vibes are very good. They had the big opening for this first purpose-built stadium for a women's soccer team in the States, and it's a very intimate stadium. There are a lot of, there's no bad seat in the house, and I think that that's nice. You get a level of, even for me, I'm used to being up in the press box, but being a little bit closer and seeing things closer to pitch side, it really changes your perspective on the tempo of the game. I do think that they should probably fill in the corner sides, not on the river side of the stadium. I think there's some very obvious places where they could expand capacity without giving up some of that intimacy. They have a lot of open air spaces in the corners right now, but I like what they've built. I think it's really, really nice, and the energy around Kansas City was so excited. I think I got the sense that the Current are doing a little bit better than the city's MLS team right now. And so people are just feeling really good about supporting a team that is winning and is doing quite well and has a lot of advertising locally throughout the city. And it feels like one of the most exciting things you can do. I was on the streetcar and I heard someone say, oh, there must be a game today. And someone said, yeah, there's a game today. And the person who was interested said, yeah, I've heard that's a tough ticket to get, which is just not what you're used to hearing about women's sports. So that was just so excited to hear, and I thought that the support in Kansas City was fantastic. On the field, I think just my main takeaways from seeing that team in person for the first time was Temwa Chawinga is a difference maker both when the team is not tired and when they are. They were off a tough travel week. Her anticipation and execution and speed of mind in inclusion of speed of play. It's just so hard for other teams to deal with. And even if Kansas City doesn't score early, a team having to deal with that over and over and over again gets harder and harder for them to contain, which led to that goal that Kansas City scored. It was scored by Dabinia, who got to work her way into the starting lineup for the first time this season. And I was also very impressed by the other player I wanted to shout out was Kansas City center back Gabby Robinson. I just was so impressed by her aerial presence. And she tended to be the help defense, the help defender up on set pieces, so she had to do a lot of cleanup work when the ball moved in transition. She's a player that was thrown into a really tough rookie season last year as the team struggled, and she's become such a nice anchor of that defense. So I was just very impressed with Gabby Robinson as well. I think Kansas City is very happy with 2 clean sheets back to back. North Carolina, again, they just need a striker. I think that, like I said, you can be happy with underlying stats until the stat that you're actually seeing is that you're not finishing chances that you're generating. It was reported actually that they had offered a lot of money to Manchester United forward Nikita Paris to make an immediate transfer this spring, and that doesn't really surprise me. That sort of generative possession is there. They can control games pretty well, but they're just not putting the ball in the back of the net. And I think it's like the issue where you see all the good stuff, but there's a glaring hole, and the glaring hole now at this moment is turning into results. So fascinated to see how they handle that. But speaking of teams that can put games away, goodness gracious, Portland takes down Seattle 4-0. Game got out of hand late. It was a 1-0 game for a long time, and then there was a penalty given, and that sort of opened the floodgates for Portland. Sophia Smith's had 3 assists and a goal. I feel like I'm talking about her every week, but every week there's just more attacking numbers for her. I think Seattle's attack needs help. They're also dealing with some key injuries that they're struggling with, but I think if this game had not ended 4-0, I mean, I think Seattle was pretty unhappy with the penalty call, but even if that game had not ended 4-0, I think it would have ended 1-0 to Portland just because of what the Reign was struggling to generate in their attacks. So we always talk about how the Reign create a lot of chances, but don't always finish them. The unfortunate regression that I think we're seeing from Seattle is that now they're not even really generating those chances anymore. So how do you move back into feeling like your defense and your midfield and maybe just get things out to someone like Sofia Huerta, get crosses in, get balls in the mixer, is turning into things that you can finish because they're not really set up to go down and come back. So it's been a tough season so far for Seattle, and I think I'm curious to see if any adjustments are made specifically in who they're starting and maybe thinking about at what point do you start thinking about this is no longer a team in win now mode? And then my only other note on Orlando is just they kind of on the opposite end are having some struggles turning their dominant attack into more goals, playing really good defense. But I do think a point of improvement for them is putting games away. But the game I kind of want to go long on for a second was actually not a win, not a loss, not a trend. There was a little bit more to grab onto actually because I think the result ended in a tie, which was Gotham versus San Diego. It was a 1-1 draw. And I think it's notable, right? This is still the reigning champion versus the reigning Shield winners. It's still a rematch of the Challenge Cup, the single game Challenge Cup that we saw at the beginning of this season. But these teams are kind of moving through sort of tricky availability issues, and we're seeing some of the quality win out, or maybe some of the mentality win out as they deal with sort of a tricky 2024 after so much success in 2023. Gotham is beginning to recover a little bit from their long availability report. We're seeing Rose Lavelle available. Lynn Williams really looks like she's warming into the season. We've gotten a couple really nice strikes from her in recent weeks. Emily Sonnet has been productive in the midfield. Crystal Dunn brings that creativity. But I do actually want to mention one other offseason pickup for Gotham that made the biggest difference in this particular game, which was Ellis Stevens. So in Stevens, she was a free agent that came out of Chicago. She was signed by Gotham. Her signing got maybe lost in the mix a little bit because there were so many U.S. Women's National Team players that the team had acquired prior to that. There was a question of playing time. How does she fit in with such a stacked squad? But this is a good example of how seasons don't always go the way that you expect, and sometimes you need other players to step up. Stevens is more of a possession style, back to goal, sort of a forward. She's been the perfect player to rotate in and out with Esther up top. I think those two, the more they train together, the more they start to reflect one another as players. I think very highly of Stevens. Her tendencies has always been a little bit more of a connective player, perhaps more naturally a number 10 coming out of college. But she actually worked very, very hard individually to develop some of those forward-specific skills because that was a need for the Red Stars, and that's what got her on the field as a starter. There was a time when the Red Stars had a very deep midfield, and they didn't really need that type of a player, but they maybe needed a player to connect and to playmake from sort of that back-to-goal forward position. And now she seems to be benefiting from that work. It's a little bit of best of both worlds. You looked at her goal against San Diego, and she creates this goal from the midfield. She's the one who springs the ball out, who generates that play. And then she puts herself in the right position to finish the chance. And it was an excellent little bit of skill to bring the ball down to the half volley and give the Gotham an opening goal. That kind of midfield to attack play is what I think I've mentioned that Jaden Shaw is very good at for San Diego. And just really nice to see a player like Stevens do that. I think Gotham is continuing to improve game after game. They're beginning to sort of turn into that team that we thought they could become. But it's going to take everybody, and it's going to take all of the depth that they have as availability goes in and out with some of these more high-profile players. So I really liked what I saw from Gotham. I kind of thought Gotham should have gotten all 3 points from this game. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe this game gets played in a month and Gotham does actually find a way to get all 3 points. But San Diego, similarly, they're really wiped out right now. Alex Morgan didn't play in this game. Naomi Gurma, Sophia Jakobsen, Abby Dahlkemper, Jaden Shaw, even like she picked up a knock late. Like they're just really going through it with injuries right now. And that's a team that has their own balance issues. And when their impact players are gone, it was pretty fascinating to see them kind of get a point out of this. The mentality element is there. And I think when Naomi Girma, her availability is not there, I think the main point of possession for them in the back is actually Caitlin Sheridan as their goalkeeper, and I thought she was very good in this game. You want them to have a chance to kind of become more sturdy. You want them to be able to possess and dominate, turn possession into attack. But I was just impressed by their mindset to come back here when they were getting peppered in front of goal quite a bit and they were missing a lot of their impact players. So I would like both of these teams to be playoff teams by the end of the season because I think they have a lot of interesting looks they can show. And I think I said this about Orlando last week. I just always think that the character sometimes comes out when you do see that adversity. And so I was impressed. I was impressed by both teams. I would like San Diego, hopefully, to get healthier in the future so they can start really imposing their style of play on teams because I still think they have to be very reactive right now with who they have available. Other quick NWSL notes, Paige Nielsen scored at the death against Angel City to give Houston, her brand new side, a 1-0 win after a trade mid-season at the trade deadline. It was very dramatic. It was fantastic football. It was long stoppage time. The stoppage time has been long, and I know that there actually have been some concerns raised that it's impacting player fitness, but incredible goal from Nielsen and big drama. Washington bounced back against Racing Louisville after losing to Portland. Croy Bethune continues her Rookie of the Year campaign very strong. And Chicago keeps winning winnable games. I think that, they're a team, we talk always about some of the issues that they have maybe with controlling a match, but they keep winning the games in front of them that they are expected to win. And that's a really nice place for a team to be as they rebuild. And that's kind of how you do possibly sneak into the playoffs. If you just keep winning the game in front of you while other teams drop points, sometimes it doesn't matter who it is, how you got there, or whether they can beat some of the top teams in the league. But you can make the playoffs by grinding out results, and I really like that from Chicago. So another good weekend. I'm interested to see things separate. And kind of like I said, that Gotham and San Diego game, I think we're going to start seeing some of the more interesting play happen in the middle, happen between these teams that are very competitive with one another and maybe don't have the ability to put it all together right now. So they're going to have to get inventive in how they get points because points are essential. So real quick to close out, we're going to do some quick hit news, all news, very little analysis. I want to talk about WHL. Boston is in the Walter Cup final after 3 straight overtime wins over Montreal. The first triple overtime game in WHL history happened in Game 2. It took years off of fans' lives. It was fantastic. It's a bit of an upset. Boston kind of faltered through the end of the regular season while Montreal was in contention for a top seed. And yeah, Boston in a hockey final. Who would have thought it? Toronto is trying to put Minnesota away to join Boston in the final. They lead their series 2-1, and they will play Game 4 on Wednesday night. Moving on to WNBA, Vivianne Miedema is leaving Arsenal. She announced this week. Career-leading double scorer. She's moving on. She never fully regained her place in the starting lineup after returning from an ACL injury. She's been linked to Manchester City. It's kind of spicy. You never know when a player makes that announcement if they're staying in the league. Looks like it. Perhaps doesn't want to leave England, but no longer quite sees her place at Arsenal. Maybe waves of change. I think that WSL next year is going to be real interesting. We're seeing some coaches leave. We're seeing some players move. Just fascinating to see what all of that looks like. I'm excited. Iowa coach Lisa Bluter unexpectedly announced her retirement early this week. Talk about waves of change. My goodness. Talked about this a little bit when Tara Vanderveer made the same announcement for Stanford. NIL, transfer portal, conference realignment. There are a number of coaches nearer to retirement than not who are considering calling it a career just because of some of the large waves of change. Bluter also obviously hit just a fantastic high point with the last 2 Iowa seasons. So I do understand this, and she's passing the reins on to longtime assistant coach Jan Jensen, who will take over. I like it. I like that line of succession, and I do kind of understand where these coaches are coming from when they're thinking about letting perhaps coaches slightly more well-versed in the current reality of college sports take over. And then finally, we have a name for the Golden State WNBA team, the Valkyries. Golden State Valkyries. So you think about like Golden State Warriors, Golden State Valkyries. Their main color is going to be purple, which I think was surprising for people, or they said sort of a violet. I like it. Like the colorway. Paige Beckers actually had high marks for the colorway, which is kind of a funny moment for a player who's going to be going pro next year. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Golden State Valkyries. We're very excited for expansion here at JWS, and I like the logo a lot, actually. So I think this is a swing and a hit. I really do. But you guys let me know what you guys think. So this has been this week's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. We will be back next week with more NWSL, more WNBA, probably more quick hit news. And with every week that passes, we get closer and closer to Emma Hayes' first U.S. Women's National Team roster, which will drop prior to their first game on June 1st of this upcoming international break. So stay tuned, stay locked in. This has been The Late Sub.